I was sitting on the balcony of my small apartment in Florence, the warm Italian sun spilling across terracotta tiles, when my phone rang. The voice on the other end wasn't unfamiliar, it was sharp, urgent, trembling with fear. "Mom," she stole from the family business and ran. The words hit me like a hammer. Time seemed to stretch and compress at once. The scent of blooming jasmine wafting from the courtyard below mixed with the bitter aroma of espresso I'd barely touched. I felt a cold hollow where my calm should have been. My older daughter's betrayal had never truly left me, though years had muted the sting. But now, a second shock, my 19-year-old adopted daughter, my youngest, was somehow entwined in this chaos. I felt the weight of age pressing on my shoulders as I booked the earliest flight home, each passing hour stretching my chest with anxiety. I had walked a long life, each wrinkle on my hands and face a testament to quiet endurance, to patience I thought eternal. Yet, the thought of her, alone, terrified, forced me out of my carefully maintained composure. Landing felt surreal. The familiar hum of the airport, the cold brush of November air, even the smell of exhaust and damp pavement, it all blended into a grotesque prelude. I drove to her last known location, a rundown neighborhood that smelled of oil, rain, and decay. My heart pounded with a mixture of dread and resolve. And then I saw her, hunched over in the front seat of a rusty hatchback, her face pale and streaked with tears, a tiny life growing beneath her ribcage like an unexpected, fragile flame. She pushed me away, shaking, her sobs splitting the quiet evening. "Don't touch me! Stay away!" I wanted to scream, to shake her into sense, but I stayed still, letting the weight of my presence anchor her. Something was terribly wrong. I could see it in the hollowed panic of her eyes, in the way her hands trembled. Memories of betrayal, of deceit I had endured over decades, mingled with a deep, protective fury. That night, as I watched her from the shadows of the parking lot, I realized this wasn't just about lost money or dishonesty. This was about survival, about justice long delayed. And in the silence between her cries and my own steady breathing, a thought began to crystallize: I would act. But not rashly. Slowly. Calculatedly. Something told me that revenge, when patient and precise, could heal the deepest wounds. And in that quiet moment, I began to plan. The next morning, the chill of early winter seeped through my coat as I stood outside the small apartment where my youngest had been staying. Her car had been gone, replaced by the echoes of uncertainty. I felt each breath like a weight pressing on my chest, a reminder of every year, every betrayal, every failure I had endured. Age had taught me patience, but it had also sharpened my perception. Nothing escaped me, not a glance, a whisper, or the tremor of fear in a young woman's eyes. I began to ask questions. Slowly. Carefully. I spoke to neighbors, to the cashier at the corner store, even to the security guard who never noticed much, yet, when pressed, revealed everything. Little details that pieced together the story like a fractured mosaic. My adopted daughter had been abandoned by someone she trusted, left to fend for herself while carrying a child she wasn't ready to protect. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years: protective fury, an old, quiet hunger for justice. Sitting in my daughter's abandoned car, the cracked vinyl seat still warm from the night, I let my mind wander back decades, to the countless betrayals I had endured in silence. Friends who turned their backs, family who demanded loyalty yet offered none. Life had taught me to endure, to measure my words, to wait. Now, those lessons became tools. Revenge, I realized, wasn't an act, it was a strategy. I traced her steps over the past week, following the trail of unpaid bills, missed calls, and abandoned promises. Each discovery was a stitch in the fabric of a plan, each lie uncovered, a weight lifted. I wasn't angry in the way a younger person might be, my fury was refined, simmering beneath the surface, patient and precise. By nightfall, I had formed the contours of a strategy. Not reckless confrontation, not impulsive vengeance, but a methodical, unavoidable reckoning. I would expose the truth, uncover the lies, and ensure that those responsible, those who had hurt my family, left a young woman to suffer, would face consequences. And yet, even as I plotted, a gnawing thought lingered: revenge always exacts a price. The question was whether I was willing to pay it, not in money or labor, but in the fragile peace I had fought so long to maintain. As I returned to the apartment, the faint smell of damp earth and burning wood from nearby chimneys clinging to my coat, I whispered to the night, almost to myself, "It's time. They will see. They will remember." I did what my bones and my decades taught me. I moved slow and I listened. Revenge, I decided, would not be fireworks. It would be a long, quiet excavation, digging through ledgers and lies until the rot showed. For 3 days I lived between two worlds, the fluorescent hum of the small law office where I rented a desk, and the cramped, warmed interior of my old sob, where I slept and read invoices by a single, shaking lamp. The law office smelled of paper and lemon cleaner. I read contracts until the words blurred, the thin paper rasping like dry leaves between my fingers. I traced signatures with my fingertip, felt the indifference in the ink. My oldest daughter's name appeared where it shouldn't. Another name, Marco, kept surfacing, a man who smiled too easily at family dinners. Each revelation landed in me like a wind-blown stone, small at first, then building weight. I called old friends, people who owed me favors for reasons that had nothing to do with kindness. There was Rosa, who ran the garage where the hatchback had been left. She remembered the boys who had visited at odd hours. There was Paolo, who kept an eye on local ledgers and had a way of finding what banks tried to forget. I paid in coffee and patience, and the one thing that still worked on them, my steadiness. People took me seriously. They always had. Age wrapped itself around me like armor. It made me look harmless and, paradoxically, dangerous. At night I returned to the car and unfolded a map of the business accounts, names circled in pencil, phone numbers scrawled in the margins. The city smells changed as the hour turned, diesel and wood smoke, the distant sizzle of late-night fryers. I held the crumpled receipt of a wire transfer until its edges softened under my thumb. I felt something like triumph, but tempered, like tasting vinegar after wine. A life of small indignities had taught me to recognize the cost of any victory. The plan itself was surgical. First, gather irrefutable proof. Then, create a stage where the truth could not be ignored, the company's next board meeting, when the lights were bright and witnesses numerous. I arranged for evidence to be delivered to the board, copies of transactions, emails, a trail of receipts that threaded from the safe to the bank accounts of people who smiled for photographs in our living room. But beneath the mechanics there was a knotted caution. Revenge would answer some questions and raise others. I found myself, for the first time in years, calculating collateral, not money, but the relationships that would fracture. I thought of my adopted daughter sleeping in the back of a car, of her small, quick inhalations as if she were saving breath for something fierce. I thought of my oldest daughter's face at 50, the lines around her mouth. I thought of my own hands, mottled and steady, which would be stained in ways I could not yet name. When the packages were ready, I sat on the curb and watched the city breathe. The plan was set. The slow machinery of justice, levered by my hands, began to turn. I walked into the boardroom with a coat that smelled faintly of oil and lemon, the remnants of my errands and the cafe where I'd kept my nerves honest with coffee. The room was too bright, the lights humming with an indifferent clarity that made faces look smaller, truer. The table gleamed, polished wood, a ring of chairs like witnesses. My packet sat heavy in my bag, copies of transfers, a ledger with Marco's scrawl, photographs of invoices, a printout of emails that threaded like a rope from the safe to a private account. Evidence, not accusation. I had learned the difference. They waited for niceties, small talk, the ritual of civility. My oldest daughter sat across from me, perfumed and composed, eyes quick to armor. Around her, the board murmured, men in tailored coats who had eaten in our kitchen and said the right things. They looked at me the way people look at a relic, honoring the past while refusing its demands. I felt their curiosity and their dismissal both. Age had taught me not to flinch at condescension. Instead, I laid the documents on the table, one by one, like small, indelible stones. "These are your signatures," I said, and gave no flourish. The words were dry as bread. The room shifted. Phones came out. Fingers tapped. Faces that had once laughed in our living room grew pale. My oldest daughter's lip trembled, she opened her mouth and closed it again. Marco, who had always been charming in the spots where truth was inconvenient, turned rudderless. I did not shout. I did not beg. I narrated, transfers on the 12th, the coded notes, the fake invoices with smudged rubber stamps. I watched the color drain from an orderly life into the small, clinical squares of printed paper. The board's lawyer cleared his throat. Consequences began like a machine starting, motions, requests for audits, a temporary freeze. The legal language felt like rain, inevitable and cold. Out in the hall afterward, my knees ached with the sudden exertion of having carried so many years into a single act. My daughter followed me, shoulders tight with shame that had the same outline as anger. You couldn't have come to me first, she whispered. I thought of the hatchback, of the warm vinyl and the tiny life she sheltered beneath her ribs. I thought of the woman she had become and the girl she had been. I came as far as I could, I said. The answer was thin, but true. There were immediate, tangible results, payroll audits, frozen accounts, whispered resignations. People who had traded ethics for convenience were exposed in fluorescent light. But there was a cost more private than corporate. My family's kitchen table, once a place of shared bread and easier laughter, now sat at a small, stubborn divide. My oldest daughter's eyes held the old betrayal's sharpness and a new, deeper sorrow. The adopted girl, when she learned, pressed her hand against her belly and wept, not only for what had been taken, but for the way truth had arrived, surgical, late, and unavoidable. That night I sat alone on the stoop and let the city breathe around me. The plan had worked in the concrete sense. Justice, measured, slow, had its first ripple. But the emotional currents ran deeper, relief braided with a hollow ache. I had unlatched an old wound and stitched a new seam. Sleep came neither easily nor wholly, because revenge had done what it was built to do and left me to reckon with what it could not fix. The morning after the boardroom storm, the world seemed both unchanged and irrevocably altered. I walked slowly along the cracked sidewalk, the autumn sun warm against my back, carrying the lingering scent of burned leaves and exhaust. Every step reminded me that time, even in its deliberate cruelty, moves forward. Age had given me patience, but revenge, this long-delayed reckoning, had demanded a price I was only beginning to feel. At home, I found my youngest daughter sitting quietly by the window, her hands folded over the swell of her belly. She looked older than 19, wiser and more fragile, like a porcelain figure that had been jostled in a storm but not shattered. We spoke little at first, only sharing space and warmth. In her presence, the weight of decades pressed differently, not with anger, but with the gentle gravity of responsibility and love. I realized revenge had not been for me alone, it had been for her, for the child she carried, for the quiet dignity of survival against cruelty. The world outside continued its indifferent rhythm. Birds argued in the hedges, a neighbor swept his porch, the distant wail of a siren broke the stillness. I felt my pulse in the slow rise and fall of my chest, each beat a reminder that I was alive, that the body could betray me but the mind could still command. I revisited memories of past betrayals, the subtle treacheries of old friends, the careless cruelty of family. Each had built a reservoir of patience and cunning that I drew upon now, not with glee, but with precision. Revenge had been an act of craftsmanship, a final, deliberate stroke in a long canvas of endurance. In the quiet hours of evening, I reflected on the consequences. The boardroom tremors had been immediate, resignations, audits, embarrassment. Yet the emotional landscape was more subtle, more intricate. My oldest daughter avoided my gaze, the adopted girl clung closer, and I understood that justice rarely heals without leaving a scar. The satisfaction of righting a wrong was tempered by the knowledge of its cost. Yet even the cost felt like a lesson written in my own hand, a mark of a life fully lived. I lit a candle and watched the flame flicker, casting dancing shadows against the walls. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and rain, of home and endurance. I let the warmth seep into my bones, a rare peace settling where tension had lived. Revenge, finally, had served its purpose, truth was laid bare, betrayal confronted, and the fragile life of a young woman shielded, in part, by my relentless will. I closed my eyes, letting the city hum softly outside. In the stillness, I felt the quiet pride of survival and the gentle relief of balance restored. I had acted with the patience of decades, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to rest, not because the world was fair, but because justice, slow and deliberate, had finally touched it.